All right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for coming to the clustering workshop uh, presented by the Waterloo Data Science Club. I'll first start off and say that this workshop is aimed at beginners, but it also goes into a little bit of theory. So it's kind of the beginner intermediate range. So don't be scared away, but also if you want something more technically challenging, it will come later on in the presentation, so don't worry. So quick introduction. My name is Jack Douglas. I'm on my second co-op term right now. I'm going into 2B software engineering. My pronouns are he, him. My email is on the slide, so you can write it down. And there's also my LinkedIn, so if you want to connect with me and just contact me via email or LinkedIn, either way. If you have questions, maybe about the content or your own side projects involving clustering, feel free to reach out to me. And also I'm on the Discord. So without further ado, let's move on to the workshop overview. So I'll be starting off with the machine learning refresher, just going over what is machine learning and the types of machine learning and kind of give you context for where clustering fits into that. Then I'm going to be going over what actually clustering is and the types of clustering, as well as going over the algorithms that we used in clustering. That's going to be the biggest part of the presentation. And then I'm going to touch on 3 real-world clustering applications at the end and go over a short notebook demo. It's fairly short, but the goal of it is to kind of show where some Python libraries that use clustering are and sort of how to work on your own project involving some of the stuff that I discuss in this presentation. Harry said, could you link / let me know who to contact? I'll send actually before going on. Can I throw it? I'm going to quickly just type the slideshow into the chat so that people can have it for after. And then once you have that, you can also, you'll have access to the notebook. So I don't know, maybe click on that and then you'll have it. And then you can also just follow along in the Zoom. But without further ado, let's begin. Okay, so machine learning refresher. So what is machine learning? So I've posted a definition on the slide here, but I think without just reading it off verbatim, the crux of machine learning is getting a program to do a task without explicitly programming to do it. And so the goal is to extract functions, is to search for a function that connects input with output data. So it's all about this function search. And so that's why I've put this little diagram on the slide. It's important to note that I'll go on a bit in the next slide about supervised versus unsupervised learning, but you won't always have output data. It won't always be clear. And sometimes your goal is to just find structure within the input data. But ultimately, the goal is to choose a learning system that extracts a pattern from data from input to output so that you can replicate this, you can apply this pattern to new data. And so there are 3 paradigms within machine learning. There's supervised learning, there's unsupervised learning, and there's reinforcement learning. I won't really talk about reinforcement learning, but I just wanted to compare supervised versus unsupervised. Clustering is an unsupervised technique, so I just wanted to give context for where it fits into what we call machine learning. So supervised learning refers to the technique of training a model on labeled data. So as I said in the previous slide, labeled data refers to when you have the output. So I've posted an image of these dogs, these cartoon dogs and cats. And as you can see underneath them, they're labeled dog and cat. In contrast, unsupervised learning is when you train a model on unlabeled data to determine the inherent structure of the data. So you would just have pictures of dogs and cats, but your program wouldn't actually know what is a dog and what is a cat. Its goal is to figure out the similarities between the the data that it's being trained on in order to create what are called clusters, which I'll explain on a bit later. But I do want to say that that even though these are compared, I'm comparing them, they are different. They're often used in tandem. So just because you're using supervised learning doesn't mean you can't use unsupervised learning for the same problem. And also I want to just go over some quick definitions as well. When I say train, that's just basically getting an algorithm to teach a model basically what the patterns are in the data. So you'll often hear me say train or fit. These are synonyms, and the goal is to have a model extract this pattern from the data to get the function, to get the output, or to structure the data in some way. So let's move on. So what is clustering? So the whole idea of this workshop. Well, it's basically a way of grouping similar data. It's a synonym for groups, basically, in which each data point within a cluster is similar to each other, and data between clusters tend to have different features. And so your goal is to determine a pattern in the data such that when you get new data, you can place it, you can plot it maybe on your graph and see which cluster it falls into and make a prediction based on your clusters. And so it's a common unsupervised learning technique, and it has a whole range of applications. It's important to note that, so I'll quickly bring it back to the dog and cat example. One cluster could be also dogs, and one cluster could be cats. So you can achieve the same purpose of predicting on images, whether it's a dog or cat, using unsupervised learning. However, I'll also point out that sometimes there are features within your data that you might not expect. So let's say you had a data set of cartoon dogs and cats and real photos of dogs and cats. And while you might use clustering to try and classify images between dogs and cats, what your model might end up learning is to classify between cartoons and real images. So it's just important to note that with clustering, the patterns that it extracts from the data and structures, and the patterns that it extracts for its predictions might not always be what you expect, but yeah, so that I just wanted to point that out. So moving on, so there are two types of clustering techniques or approaches. There's hard clustering and there's soft fuzzy clustering. For the vast majority of this presentation, I'll be going over hard clustering, but if you're interested in learning about soft or fuzzy clustering, you can go to the Wikipedia page. The most common soft clustering technique is called the fuzzy C algorithm. And basically the difference between the two is that, as I've written, is that hard clustering, a data point can exist to only one cluster. It can only belong to one cluster. Whereas with soft clustering, each data point has a list of probabilities for the likelihood of it being a part of a particular cluster. It's much less common, but it has fewer use cases, but it's still important to just be aware of. Maybe if you're interested, again, you can go in more depth. But we'll move on to the clustering algorithms. So there's over 100 different clustering algorithms, and each type has different use cases depending on the data, and they each follow their own process. And as I said before, when I was defining what clustering is, the goal between all of them is to create a grouping such that the points within the cluster are similar to one another. But similarity, or being similar is kind of a vague term. And so the reason we have so many different types of clustering techniques is because each one has their own basis for defining what similarity means. That can be, it can be spatial similarity, so like how close they are. It can be how dense the area is. And I go over that in more detail when I'm explaining them. And the 4 examples I've listed, centroid-based, connectivity-based, density-based, and distribution-based, I touch on all 4 of those coincidentally. There's obviously many more, but those are the 4 most popular ones. Today, I'll be going into more depth in the centroid-based and connectivity-based, particularly with their processes, but I'll give you a high-level overview of how density-based and distribution-based techniques also work. So moving on to centroid-based clustering. So the basis for this is that the notion of similarity is derived by the closeness of a data point to the centroid of the clusters. Now I've italicized two words there, closeness, and you might begin to pick up a theme here in this workshop is that there's kind of a lot of vague terms. The reason I've used closeness and italicized it is because there are many different ways of determining closeness. In terms of distance, there are several different metrics, which I go on in the next slide, but the most obvious one to most people is Euclidean distance, so the straight line length between 2 points, but you can also do some other metrics can be used. And also for centroid-based clustering, an important characteristic of this technique is that the number of clusters must be specified beforehand. This is seen as a bit of a limitation to this technique, despite its popularity. It is the most popular clustering technique, but in order to give a number of clusters, you must have some understanding of the data beforehand. And there are some techniques that can help you pick the number of clusters. There's something called the elbow method, which I can go into at the very end if people have specific questions about that. So if anyone's interested, you can write that down and I can talk about beforehand, but that's kind of divulging from the main point of the workshop. And also centroid-based clustering models, they run iteratively to find where the local optima is for the centroids of these clusters. So the goal is to have each data point within a cluster be as close to a central centroid for all of the clusters. So that might be confusing, but when I go through the process and the visualization, it becomes a very intuitive process that hopefully many of you will understand. So first, some definitions and calculations. So centroid refers to the central point of each cluster, and it can be calculated as the mean of the x and y's of the data. It can be x, y, z, and so on. There can be many variables, but it's the mean of all of them. And then, as I said before, there are many different metrics of closeness, such as the Euclidean distance, as I mentioned. If you're interested in other metrics, pardon me, you can go to this link, but there's the squared Euclidean distance, there's the maximum distance, Manhattan distance. It's important to note that for centroid-based clustering, the metric that you choose does have an effect on the clusters that you produce. So doing your research and figuring out if you want to apply centroid-based clustering to your own project and you're doing some research, you want to make sure that you're using the right metric for your purpose. In many cases, though, I will say Euclidean distance is the most popular. It's usually pretty good. Second to that is the Manhattan distance, which is an interesting metric. So yeah, if you're interested, I would recommend that being the second one you look into. So I've talked about a technique of clustering, but I'm going to give you a specific algorithm. It's far and away the most popular. It's called the k-means clustering method. And so the process has 6 steps. And again, there's a lot of text and it's somewhat difficult to explain via words, but I have a visualization that hopefully will help you all. So the first step is to specify the desired number of clusters, and we call that number k. So that's where the k-means comes from. The second step is to randomly place the k centroids within the data. The third step is to assign each data point to its nearest, each data point to its nearest centroid, and then we recompute the cluster centroids based on the clusters that are created. And then we repeat steps 4 and 5 until no further improvements can be made to the location of the centroid, such that the centroid is as close to all the data points within its own cluster as possible. So Jay has just asked, Jack, how should we go about choosing the distance metric to use? Does it depend on the distribution of the data? Yeah, so one thing, yeah, that's a good question. So you'll find that different, I'm going to go on to the other clustering algorithms like the hierarchical clustering and the distribution and density. But it's good that you point out, you'll find that each of these techniques also have slightly different shaped clusters. So the k-means clustering, it creates very circular clusters, and the hierarchical clustering, that will produce what are called I'm really bad with pronunciation, but it's basically like a tree classifier. So when I come to that part, it will be quite obvious. Distribution clustering, those create oval-like clusters. And so, yeah, so if you know what your data looks like when you visualize it, I know we had a visualization workshop a couple of weeks ago, so that's where that might come in handy. You can figure out which approach to use in terms of the, yeah, hopefully that answers your question. So yeah, so onto the visualization. So here is, here's an image of basically the rings that are not filled in are the centroids, and the circles that are filled in are the data points. And so as we said before, the first step is to randomly place the centroids throughout the data. So where the circles exist at this moment, they were randomly placed. And then the second step is that the data points are assigned to the cluster whose centroid is closest to that data point. So all the purple data points are going to that, are purple because they're closest to that centroid of that cluster. Same with the red, same with the blue. So now what we have here is that we have a purple cluster, a blue cluster, and a red cluster. But it's important to note that the centroids, where they exist right now, are not the centroids of these newly created clusters. They were randomly placed. So we have to recompute them with their new clusters. And you'll notice that in this first iteration, the purple cluster, it moved way down to the bottom left, and the red cluster moved up to the top left, and the blue, the centroids, the purple centroid moved down to the bottom left, the red centroid moved up to the top left, the blue to the right. And so we then repeat the same process. All the data points are then reassigned. So if a data point is now closer to a different centroid, it switches from one cluster to another. And so we repeat this process basically until the centroids no longer move around and all of the data points are assigned to their closest centroid of the cluster. And that is basically how the clustering is done with k-means. So we do it again, and the centroids, sorry, they're not randomly placed. They're moved again. That was a mistake. But the data is assigned to its closest centroid, and as we can see now, the data now has three groupings or three clusters clearly, and that's kind of step by step how this process works. And this was only 2 iterations, but very frequently it'll be many more. I just wanted to quickly demonstrate how the k-means algorithm works. So if you want to try it out for yourself, here's a link, which you can do after this workshop. But so quickly, I'll go over some of the characteristics of k-means. So as I said before, it's the most common clustering algorithm, which is nice because it's so intuitive. It's very fast due to the small number of calculations, so it's very efficient. However, a limitation of it, as I mentioned before, is that you have to specify the number of clusters. That can be solved, though, using the elbow method, which I can explain at the end. And an important note also is to mention that the results can differ between runs of the algorithm. And the reason for this is because where the centroids are initially placed is random. So if your centroids are randomly placed in particular areas of the data, that can affect what clusters you get for your model and so on and so forth. It's important to be aware of that. onto the second clustering technique, which is called connectivity-based clustering. And the basis for this is that the notion of similarity is derived by the closeness of data points to each other. So I want to take a moment just to pause and really emphasize this, that it sounds really close to what the centroid-based clustering is, but I just want to point out the important distinction that with centroid-based clustering, it was the closeness of data points specifically to the centroid of the cluster. Whereas with connectivity-based clustering, it's the closeness of data points to each other. So that is an important distinguishing aspect of it. It's easy to get like confused in terms of the bases of these two different techniques. And so again, closeness is a subjective term, and so there are different metrics that can be used. However, if you want to use connectivity-based clustering, it might be useful to know that the average linkage function is the metric that's most commonly used for connectivity-based clustering. There's no point in really going into the details of how that function works, but or like specifically how the math works, but from a higher level, the goal of it is such that the distance between two clusters is minimized. So you basically take the distance between each pair of data points within two clusters, and whichever two clusters has the smallest of this, you group them together. And so that will make more sense in the next slide when I show an animation of this. But before that, I'm just going to say that there are two different approaches. There's bottom-up connectivity-based clustering, and there's top-down connectivity-based clustering. They both achieve the same goal. There's different ways of doing it. And the difference is kind of like the direction you go in. So bottom-up, you start off with every data point starting as its own cluster, and they group together, clusters group together as the distance between them increases, as the distance decreases. And the opposite of that with top down, all the data points start in one cluster and partition as distance increases. So hopefully it will make a bit more sense with this animation. So basically how this is an example of bottom up hierarchical or bottom up connectivity based clustering, and this specific algorithm is called hierarchical agglomerative clustering, which refers to the bottom-up technique. So in the animation, you can see that basically whenever there's two data points, you group together the two closest ones, and those become a group. And it's important to note that clusters can group together with other clusters to form a bigger cluster. And we know that with hierarchical agglomerative clustering, or HAC, we know that HAC is finished when there's one big cluster that contains all the data points. So just going over basically I just explained what the process is. So you treat all the data points on their own, determine the two closest clusters, which are based on the closest distance metric we have chosen. We combine the two clusters, and we repeat that until we have one cluster containing all the data. So you might be wondering, this seems kind of strange. Your prediction ends up being like a tree or something. I don't see any use cases, but in fact, you'll find that there are lots of biological applications. It can be used with sequencing data. And the most prominent example for many of you might be if you've taken biology, you'll notice that it might be reminiscent of kingdoms and phyla and classes and orders. And so that is an example of how hierarchical agglomerative clustering works in the real world. So, there's a couple of questions. Sorry, I missed that. How do you use k-means algorithm to the cat and dog example? Yeah, so I mean, okay, sorry, going back a couple of slides. So you could use that with the cats and dogs example. So each pixel basically has, if you've ever done a computer vision project before, you'll know that each pixel has a value. Typically, you normalize that from 0 to 255. So these are what are known as pixel intensities, and you can group similar pixel intensities together. So that's one of the applications I talk about later, which is image segmentation. And so if you have, so for the cats and dogs example, basically you can cluster in such a way that you have similarly shaped images be grouped together, and you can find that, or sorry, you can, if you have an image that aligns with a particular cluster that you've seen from training on the images of dogs and cats, you can use that to predict what the image is. And so I can go into more depth when I go later on. Then Jay asks, okay, he explains that. Okay. So yeah, so some characteristics of Hack is that we can select the best number of clusters since we are building a tree. So remember, that was a limitation of centroid-based clustering and k-means, but with Hack we can choose the best number of clusters. So you'll think about, if you think about like my example with biology and like kingdoms and phyla and classes, those are kind of in a way almost arbitrary groupings. Like we could say that two particular classes together is another word, like is another type of grouping, but it was just determined after that it is that we had the freedom of choosing the best number of clusters, which is important, because if you choose too many clusters, each cluster becomes less significant in terms of like the features, the information that you can get from it. But if we choose too few, it becomes too general. So for example, if we had too specific of a grouping, then what's the point in having birds encompass like all types of birds, whereas if we just had animals maybe as our grouping, we'd never be able to distinguish between a cat and a dog. Hopefully that makes sense. Another thing is that it's about Hack is that it's not sensitive to the choice of the distance metric. Unlike, I think this is the only clustering method that has this quality. Most are very sensitive to the distance metric used. I mentioned that with connectivity-based clustering, people typically use the average linkage function, but you could technically use a whole bunch of other things, and it wouldn't have a huge impact on what you get. So yeah, and then in terms of applications, it's useful when data has underlying hierarchical structure. So connectivity-based clustering, it's very unique compared to the other methods, and it still has a lot of applications. So that's why it's so popular. The big drawback of connectivity-based clustering and Hack is that it comes at the cost of low efficiency and very high time complexity. So it has limited scaling. Unlike k-means, when you had very fast computations, the time complexity of Hack is O of n to the 3. And if you've experience with big O or just time complexity, you'll know that that's really big. So you're not able to apply it to huge, enormous amounts of data, unlike with k-means, which operates in linear time. And so that is just another nice to know when you consider your own projects and whatnot. So I'm going to talk about density-based clustering here, and then distribution-based clustering in the next slide. I'll just preface it by saying that I'm going to give a more higher level overview of how they work, as opposed to like going step by step the process, because I think it's not necessary to go into the details, because you'll never have to like re-implement DB scan, for example. I mean, you likely won't have to do that with k-means either, but it's more important to understand the theory with the previous two algorithms I've mentioned, as opposed to these next two. So the basis for density-based clustering is that the notion of similarity is derived by the varied density of data points. So in this image, or in this animation on the right, we see DB scan, which is an algorithm. It stands for density-based spatial clustering of applications with noise. So it's useful for data that has noise. That's the big thing. It can remove it. And how it works is that you specify two things. You specify a maximum distance and a maximum distance for 2 points to be considered neighbors, and you specify the minimum number of points in a neighborhood to be considered a cluster. And so how it works is that you start off with a random point and you count all the data points within a radius epsilon of that data point. And if that is greater than the specified minimum number of points, then you have a cluster. Then you reapply this to all the points in that cluster that you have, and that's how the cluster expands. So as you can see right now, there's lots of little circles being drawn in this animation, and it moves around in a circular fashion. And every point must be visited before the algorithm is finished. And if you have a point that has fewer surrounding data points than is needed in a neighborhood, then it is disregarded as noise. So that's what's useful about it. You'll also notice that in contrast to like kind of k-means and even hierarchical, the idea of closeness is different, because there are points on the circle cluster that are diametrically opposite, which are much farther apart, right, than you'd expect. If you used like k-means, for example, the clustering is all about the centroid. You'll get a much different cluster shape, and you won't have like this nice, these four nice clusterings for the smiley face. So this is a scenario in which understanding kind of what the data looks like and would be very useful in determining your approach. And if you want to learn more about density-based clustering and dbScan, you can try out this visualization and go to that link for more info. So on to distribution-based clustering. So the basis for this is that the notion of similarity is derived by how probable it is that all data points in the cluster belong to the same distribution. And so again, I'll just explain it from a higher level because it involves some understanding of statistics. If you don't have much experience with statistics, that's okay. Again, it's like the fourth most common, but I say the fourth, I might sound high to you, but in reality, most people use it's much less frequently used than the first two, and even density based. So basically, you begin by selecting the number of clusters that you want, just like k-means. So that's kind of a limitation of it. And you randomly initialize Gaussian distribution parameters for each of the clusters that you've selected. And then you give these Gaussian distributions for each cluster, and you compute the probability that each data point belongs to that particular random distribution. And based on these probabilities, we can compute a new set of parameters for the Gaussian distribution such that we maximize the probabilities of data points within the clusters. And we compute these new parameters using a weighted sum of the data point positions, where the weights are the probabilities of each data point belonging to that particular cluster. And so you repeat that process I just mentioned iteratively until there's not much change from the distributions, and there's a small change in the parameters, basically. So that might have been really confusing, and that's okay. If you're interested, you can learn more about that at the link. So going on to the application. So this is probably the most interesting aspect of the presentation to maybe some of you. But before Jay asks a question, do you know any feature engineering techniques, subsampling, we could use to make the clustering algos converge faster? Yeah, that's a really good question. I am not actually too familiar with. I'm not too familiar with that. Yeah, that's a good question. I guess with k-means, since it's already pretty fast at converging, just because the computation is so quick, I don't think that that's as big of an issue. But for like hierarchical, yeah, I'm not entirely sure. But yeah, that's an interesting question that you bring up. Okay, yeah, so the first application, I'm going to show you 3 different applications in the real world and kind of where clustering is used with them. So the first one being marketing research, and the goal of it is to basically understand potential customers better and partition consumers into market segments. So the types of data that you would get for that are demographic, geographic, behavioral, psychological, and the use cases of clustering would be to help with designing products or customizing advertising campaigns. So like a very real example could be if you had the heights and weights of consumers, and this is an example of that an exec gave to me that I really liked. Yeah, so if you had the heights and weights of some consumers and you wanted to make 3 t-shirts that reached as many, that was best suited basically for your consumers based on this data that you have. You can use Centroid-Based Clustering, K-means clustering, to figure out, to create 3 clusters so that when you get a new potential consumer and they tell you what their weight and height is, you can put them into, on the graph, you can kind of point them into whatever particular cluster is best suited for them. So that's how, if you've ever gone to like a clothing website and you want to figure out what size you want, that is like that's what's being used. With customizing advertising campaigns, that's like, you can, that would be related to getting information about like gender and age and salary, and those would all affect having that information. You might create custom advertising campaigns for particular clusters to get the best success from those campaigns. So moving on to the second application, which is image segmentation, where the goal is to divide images into distinct regions. And the types of data that you'd get are pixels or images. And 2 kind of abstract use cases are border detection and object recognition. Obviously, those are very large use cases in itself. And so within them, there's very specific use cases that can be helped with. So like, for example, with tumor segmentation, you can use clustering. With border detection, obviously there's a whole bunch of different applications of border detection itself and object recognition, and clustering fits into that by basically grouping together parts of the image with similar pixel intensities. And so you can see on the right in this image, you have the original image, and then in image B, they're getting the border, they're segmenting it, and then the third is, yeah, the segmented results. So hopefully you can see that application. And then the last application is with document classification, where the goal is to classify the type of document. And the types of data that you'd get with this is like the document content itself, the topics of the document, the tags. So if you wanted to sort documents into like the different topics in the image on the right, you can see technology, sports, fashion. You can also find similar documents, so you can compare documents with a database of documents and find similar ones. A good realistic example is sorting between junk mail and regular mail. That would be a clustering problem where you're trying to create 2 clusters of junk in class and regular mail. So hopefully that is a good example for you all to understand this. So onto the demo. So here, I've already preloaded it. So this is a very simple demo. I just kind of wanted to illustrate the very clear and obvious use case of clustering, as well as bring your attention to some of the libraries that have clustering functions already created, and so that you can apply them to your own projects. So for this notebook, we're using the iris dataset, which is basically a dataset with a bunch of flower metrics. So it has information on the petal length, petal width. It has the sepal length, sepal width, and it also has the actual flower type itself. So it is a labeled dataset. And the 3 types of flowers are the iris setosa, the iris versicolor, and the iris virginica. And so the goal of this notebook is to, based on the petal length and width, create 3 clusters such that we can predict what type of flower, what type of iris flower it is based on the length and width. So that's the goal of this notebook. And so we're importing 4 libraries. We're importing matplotlib to plot our data, pandas for dealing with the actual data set and data frame, and then we import sklearn for the actually applying k-means. That's the algorithm we're going to be using. So as I said before, this is kind of what the data set. The data set has sepal lengths. There's sepal widths, petal widths, lengths, and labels. There's 150 flowers in this data set. And an important thing to note is that you might be curious why I'm using a labeled data set when I said that clustering is for unsupervised learning. It's just nice to have to verify the results of our clustering, just to illustrate the success of it. But in most cases, you won't have labels, obviously. And in those cases, you might extract patterns that, again, you might not expect, but many of them will have use cases. And the advantages of that is that you don't have to spend a lot on getting labeled data. It's really nice. You can just have raw data and extract patterns and make predictions very quickly. Okay. And so the next thing I'm doing right here is that I'm just plotting the unlabeled data and showing what it looks like. You can already tell by just looking at it that there appears to be somewhat of a cluster in the bottom left where the petal length and petal width are very small. But in the upper right, you can see that there are a bunch of data points, and it might be more difficult to distinguish between the two, and so between the types of flowers that exist within that group. And then, so this is where we actually apply the k-means clustering to the data set. So there's already a k-means function created from the sklearn library, and we are setting the number of clusters to 3 because we already know that we're just trying to classify between 3 different types of flowers. The random state equals 21. That is just so that the results are repeatable. So I mentioned before that k-means is typically unpredictable, like the results can vary, and that's because the centroid placement is random. But by setting the random state to an integer, we're basically always placing the centroids in the same spot. Now, mind you, if I changed this to a different number, if I changed that to 8 or 12, we'd still get 3 clusters. It's just that the number of iterations and like how it actually gets to the clusters may vary. So it's just to explain that. So then, we do model.fit, which basically runs our k-means algorithm on the data that we've given it. And we get the predictions. So predictions, and then we plot the predictions against the actual labels. And we see that we get three clusters as we hoped. And they line up pretty well against the actual labels. So we see that this green and red cluster, they're lining up, the blue and orange, and the yellow and gray. So we see that we have 3 clusters. Now, in most unsupervising projects, you don't actually know necessarily what the clusters represent. Like it won't always have like a specific this type of flower. It can sometimes be a unique demographic, right? It can where that has some potential for whatever application, but so you won't have that label typically. You'll just have like a cluster 1, cluster 2, cluster 3. You'll just have like clusters and you'll number them because you won't necessarily always have such obvious patterns within your data. But regardless, it still has applications. And like right here, we're showing that if I were to have a petal with width with a petal with width 0.5 and petal length of 2, it's probably going to be in cluster, the green cluster, which we can later on kind of figure out, oh, what does cluster 1 represent? But I'm just pointing out that you don't always know immediately what each cluster will represent. So that is the end of the demonstration. Thank you all for listening, and I'd be happy to take some questions. There are already some in here. So Kareem asks, hey, I am very interested in working with you on your next presentation. I was hoping you would be willing to mention the importance of the Black community within the field of data science. Yeah, that's a really important point. I can definitely get send me a message. I'll put my email in the chat, and I can connect you with the rest of the data science team, and we can work on something. So yeah, just send me an email right now. Yeah, that's a really cool point. If you have a specific project in mind relating, yeah, if you have a specific project in mind, then yeah, feel free, and we'd all be really happy to work on that with you. Diana asks, is this code available anywhere? Oh yeah, so I can also send, here I can send the notebook into the chat. One sec. So yeah, this also is being, the video is going to be uploaded to YouTube. So if you miss something and you want to go back and rewatch something that I've talked about, I know there was a lot of content in this workshop, and a lot of definitions and things like that. And so my kind of goal for this workshop was to have almost a one-stop shop for clustering information. So if you had a particular application in mind, you can check out my video, and in the description of that video, I'll include the slide, a link to the slides and this notebook. And if you are someone that wants to apply clustering techniques to a project, I'd recommend looking on Kaggle for clustering data sets, or maybe if you have a particular data set in mind, you can search for it already in Kaggle. Kaggle spelled Kaggle. I know that was something that I wish I had known about in 1A. I ended up finding out about it in 1B, and it's basically a website where people do data science competitions, and it also has a ton of different data sets. So you can just search around, look for one that piques your interest, or search for one if you have an idea in mind. You can also just look around for different notebooks or maybe different articles. And maybe you'll be able to find data sets that way. Okay, Jay says we should also post a notebook in the Discord. Yeah, I'll do that. I'll make sure to post the notebook in the Discord. And then Harry says, how does someone do beginning analysis to know which technique to use? Yeah, okay, so basically, if I think that Oja did a visualizing data workshop a couple weeks ago, and I think that workshop should be recorded and uploaded to YouTube, and that would be a good way of step one, visualizing the data. Once you do that, you'll be able to figure out your approach for tackling the problem with clustering. So as I said, with k-means clustering, those frequently create circular clusters. With density-based clustering, that's more variable. With distribution-based clustering, it's more oval-shaped, hierarchical, etc., and so on. I'd recommend that you start though with k-means clustering, because that is far and away the most popular clustering technique used. And if you have a specific, if you're looking for, Harry, I'm not sure if you're looking for a project or if you already have a project in mind and you're not where to start. Either way, feel free to message me, email me, or send me a message on Discord. I'll put a message into the events channel in the Discord, so you can find my username is Doug's, and there's a baseball player there, so that's how you'll be able to spot me. I also posted the workshop link in that channel, so you can find me there as well. And yeah, so Jay, yeah, perfect. Jay put in the link to the Waterloo Data Science Club YouTube page. There are a lot of really good resources there from years ago even. So if you ever miss a workshop, you can refer to it. It's a great resource to have. The YouTube channel, I mean. Jay asks, how do you feel about using unsupervised clustering techniques before doing supervised learning on top? Yeah, that's a great question. So typically, unsupervised clustering techniques are used with supervised learning techniques, but it's usually used before, and the goal of it is to reduce noise in the data. And so you can do that using density-based clustering, as I mentioned before, where you can reduce the noise and the outlier data that might disrupt how your model actually learns and the patterns that it extracts from it. So yeah, that's a good question. Oh yeah, also the Unlabeled Unstructured podcast is there as well. Yeah, that was a great podcast. Jennifer Yee, first episode. She was really smart lady. And there's, I think, another one coming out at the beginning of next week. So be on the lookout for that, guys. No worries. No worries, Sunil. Any other questions, guys? And also, you can send me an email after, obviously. I'm happy to help with your own journey into clustering and own projects and whatnot. And I can help you get started with a project or direct you to resources that might help you. Here, I'll just, thanks guys. Here, I'll just post the slides and notebook again one last time into the chat in case anyone missed it. So, but if there are no other questions, thanks everyone for coming and asking so many great questions. And hopefully you learn something that you can apply to your own project. So if there are no more questions, again, you can email me or message me on Discord. I think, yeah, that's everything. Thanks, guys.